Today we will be going over cross-examination. There's some nice music going on in the background. My name is Grace Hu for people in the future watching this, and we're going to be going over cross-ex. So let's do some basics. Cross-examination is essentially the questioning period that occurs after all four of the constructive speeches. The person who will be cross-examining the constructive speaker is the person who will not be giving the speech next. So, for example, after the first affirmative constructive, the second negative speaker asks the first affirmative constructive questions. After the first negative constructive, the first affirmative constructive speaker asks questions. That way you don't have someone who needs to give a speech next asking questions, and they can use that 3 minutes instead to be preparing. Each cross-examination is 3 minutes long, and you have 4 of them, so that's 12 minutes in total. And this is really a period of time to clarify your opponent's arguments, elaborate on your arguments, and establish new lines of argumentation. This is such a great time to figure out weaknesses in your opponent's case and identify strengths in yours, which can be a really good tool to make your speeches better, and you can really use what happens in cross-ex to bolster your speeches. This is also a time where you can relax and kind of let go of some of that formality that you usually adopt when you're actually speaking, whether that be in your constructives or your rebuttals. Be yourself, relax, show a little bit more personality, and be confident, because if you're confident and you sound like you know what you're saying, then it's more likely for everyone else in the room to also buy what you're saying. But with that comes a caveat of do not be rude. It's so important to be nice during cross-ex. Don't cut people off aggressively, don't answer questions aggressively, don't make fun of anyone. Be polite, be nice, be courteous. But obviously, don't take bullying either. If you're not done answering a question, be like, I'm not done yet. If you have the answer, be like, thank you, that's enough, let's move on to the next question. Don't let yourself be trampled on during cross-ex. Look at your judge when you're answering and asking questions. Your audience is the judge. You are not going to be turned to your opponent and talking to them, because you're not trying to convince them in this round, you're trying to convince your judge. Also, a really useful tool during cross-examination is to interrogate weak evidence in arguments. A lot of the time, evidence used, especially in generic off cases, is not super great, so this is a terrific time to kind of point out weaknesses in their evidence, which can also help to bolster your speeches and your arguments and claims that you're making. And finally, what happens in cross-ex stays in cross-ex mostly. Obviously, if your opponents make a huge concession, you can use that in cross-ex. But if your opponent made like a tiny slip up, or like a wording mistake, or if you didn't have the best cross-examination, there's no need to really mention that in your speeches. The content of the cross-examination can carry out throughout the round, but everything else about that cross-ex should usually just stay in cross-ex. So now we're going to talk about specifically what you should do as the asker after every single type of cross-ex. First is the cross-examination after the first affirmative speech. This is really the time to clarify any arguments or link chains that you're confused about. Especially because this is what you're going to be kind of centering the debate around throughout the rest of the round. So it's so important for you and your partner to determine what's confusing so you can really clarify that and nail it down, especially for the 1 and C. It's also a point to really clarify and hammer down on what the plan does, especially if the plan text has multiple planks or references some type of niche term, action, or legislation. You really want to fully clarify and elaborate on what exactly the plan does, so you can open yourself up to more solvency arguments, possibly off case, and you can prevent yourself from making arguments that don't really apply. And it's also a good time to interrogate the solvency advocate. I would highly recommend that during the first affirmative constructive, if you have the evidence available, to skim through that solvency advocate, because oftentimes what the plan says is not actually what the solvency advocate is advocating for. And if you can prove that cross-examination, it sets you up to have a really easy time to kind of take down their solvency throughout the round. And if you're the 1A, don't give like specific answers away. Don't, if you're trapped or if you're asking a question that you don't really specifically know the answer to, it's okay to be like, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it's like, it's rather better to give vaguer answers than more specific answers that just aren't correct. Be confident. This is the 1AC. You should know this inside and out. And you should answer questions like you know exactly what you're talking about. And talk as long as you can. If you do this right, this could be up to 3 minutes of extra speech time to elaborate on the more nuanced details and pros of your affirmative plan. Especially if they're asking these clarification questions, you can go on for as long as you can. After the first negative constructive, oftentimes, especially with this topic, people will read a counterplan or a critique. If that's like the case in this round, ask about its condition. It's like whether it's unconditional, conditional, or dispositional, and what needs to happen for it to be kicked. This is especially important, in my personal opinion, in counterplan rounds, just because that's so prevalent and because it opens you up to theory arguments and also prevents you from being surprised if they choose to kick the counterplan or critique later on in the round. It helps you prioritize timing as well. Clarify about different off cases and link stories, especially if they're reading a critique that you haven't heard before. You really want to nail down what exactly the advocate is. This also pertains to a counterplan. Really nail down what the counterplan text actually intends to do. And this way you can figure out solvency deficits and a strategy for how to better approach that piece of off case. You also want to eliminate floating pig arguments for K-debate. You want to ask questions like, can the alt achieve exactly what the plan does? Just try to shut that down before the 2 and C and 1 and R happen. Especially if it's a more K round. You might want to spend more time on clarifying the K, the alt, the solvency, the impact, but not usually. Usually impact isn't as contested, and you also want to eliminate those floating pig arguments. It's also a good idea to focus on the case arguments the 1 and C brings up, specifically things like solvency deficits, because oftentimes those are weaker and maybe not as thoroughly prepared as a counterplan, a disadvantage, or a K. When you're answering the cross-examination after the 1 and C, you really want to make sure you determine the status of your counterplan or K prior to the cross-examination with your partner. It'll make it a lot easier for you. Cross-ex after the 2AC. You want to figure out and clarify any permutations that may be confusing, especially if you're reading a critique. There are a plethora of permutations that can be made, and you kind of want to figure out which ones are actually valid and which ones they may actually be going for, and which ones are more just to waste your time. Ask questions about what you will be taking. Split the block with your 2N prior to this cross-examination. So, with your 1N, with your 2N, prior to this cross-examination. So, if you're just taking disadvantage, only ask questions about the disadvantage. Yeah. You also want to probe solvency deficits on counterplans or Ks. Usually these are the weaker arguments, and if you can take these down in cross-examination, it'll make it a lot easier for your partner and you to make those arguments in your speeches. After the 2NC, this is the last cross-examination, so it's really try or die. Don't ask about obvious arguments. Go for the more contentious and complex arguments and try to really break them down this is the point in time where you want to kind of push the person you're cross-exing to give more yes or no answers rather than giving them more leading questions that could prompt like longer answers. You really want to narrow it down to be like, does this say this? Will the impact of this be this? Will the effect of this be this? Like, you really want to narrow it down and kind of trap them in corners and shift the perception of these arguments to make them easier for your 1A to take and to make them more beneficial for you. And I would argue that fast pace is better. This is the last cross-ex. You want to get as many questions in as possible. And if you're answering, don't over answer questions. It's also good for you to keep the momentum up. If you kind of hem and haw over an answer or give like a really long, rambling answer, it doesn't make you necessarily look good. If you're able to give more concise, brief answers and keep the momentum of the cross-ex going, that's better for all parties involved. And finally, to prep for cross-examination, there are a couple of things you can do. First, being infinite cross with your partner, just sit down, get your affirmative plan out. One person pretends to be the negative side, one person pretends to be the affirmative side, and you guys just ask and answer questions. And for any questions that you aren't really sure of, you can like write out responses, and it's really a great way to practice. Another way is to go through your evidence in your affirmative case or the generic negative off case, or if you read Ks regularly, you can just go through the critique that you usually read, write questions and answers about that specific case, off case, etc. And that's also a good way to prepare for your cross-examinations. Third is to really understand generic arguments against/for your case. If circumvention is a common argument you see against your affirmative, prep really good answers to that. If you're reading a K and you get a lot of alt solvency attacks, have a lot of answers prepared for that. This can also really help with your block writing. Another thing is to really understand generic off case. This year we don't really have a lot of generic off case, which is unfortunate, but in years where there are a lot of generic disadvantages or counter plans, really understand them and understand what the weak points are so you can hammer on those in cross-examination, and understand what the strong points are so you can use them as answers when you are being cross-examined. And finally, keep on developing an understanding of the policy topic in general. This is so helpful for cross-examination and debate in general. If you get asked a question that maybe perhaps you don't have the specific answer in the context of your off case, but you have this general knowledge of the topic, you can still provide an informative answer that just kind of shuts down any perception that you may maybe like don't know what you're talking about or something like that. But at the end of the day, cross-ex is still like 20% of the debate, and it's really an opportunity for you to elaborate on your arguments. So I think practicing is a great skill, and practicing for cross-examination is going to translate into you being more prepped for the rest of the debate as well.